The day Celia Talbot walked into the Territorial courthouse of Durango, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882, every man in that room turned to look at her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she carried herself like someone who had already decided she was going to win. She was 31 years old, and she had spent the last 14 months burying her husband, grieving him honestly, raising her 7-year-old daughter alone, and watching a man named Harlan Voss try to steal everything she and her late husband had built on 40 acres of Red Mesa land west of town. She had hired a lawyer first, a man named Clifton Deeds who had taken her money, reviewed her papers, sent 3 letters that accomplished nothing, and then quietly informed her that Harlan Voss had more friends in the territory than she did, and perhaps she ought to consider selling. Celia had thanked him politely, taken her documents back, and walked out of his office into the October wind. She had spent the following 3 weeks reading every territorial land statute she could locate in the Durango public reading room, which was really just a back corner of the mercantile run by a nearsighted man named Mr. Hooper, who kept the law books because his brother-in-law had once been a clerk. She read by lamplight after her daughter Josie went asleep. She made notes in the margins of a small leather journal her husband had given her 2 Christmases before he died. She learned what she needed to know, and then she filed her own case with the Territorial Court and signed her own name to it. Word got around fast in Durango. Word always got around fast in a town of 2,000 people pressed between mountain ridges and a river that flooded every spring. By the time the court date arrived, there were at least 40 people crowded into the gallery of that courthouse, which smelled of pine resin and tobacco, and the particular dusty warmth of too many bodies in an enclosed space. Some had come to watch Harlan Voss crush a widow woman. Some had come because they admired her nerve. A few had come because they had their own grudges against Voss and wanted to see how this played out. Harlan Voss sat at the respondent's table with his attorney, a man named Prescott who wore a coat that probably cost more than Celia's monthly household expenses. Voss himself was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a thick gray mustache and the particular kind of settled confidence that comes from decades of getting what you want through money and intimidation. He did not look at Celia when she took her seat at the other table. He looked at the judge's bench, which was still empty, and he smiled at something his attorney said. The clerk called the room to order. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Ralph Langston walked in. Celia had heard his name before she ever saw his face. Everyone in the territory had heard his name. He had arrived in Durango 6 months ago, appointed by the federal circuit to replace old Judge Harmon, who had finally retired at the age of 78 after presiding over 3 decades of land disputes, cattle theft cases, and the occasional murder that the territorial marshals could not quite manage without a court's assistance. Ralph Langston was 37 years old, which was considered young for a circuit judge, and he had come from Kansas City, where he had made a reputation for being scrupulously fair and completely unbribable, both qualities that had made him unpopular in Kansas City and had gotten him quietly reassigned to the frontier where his inconvenient principles might find a more appropriate outlet. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thing she noticed. The bench elevated a judge, of course, but even accounting for that, Ralph Langston stood well over 6 feet and carried himself without any of the performative severity she had seen in other judges. He had dark hair that was going silver at the temples, and his face was the kind of face that had been weathered into something interesting, not pretty, not harsh, but honest in the way that certain landscapes are honest, showing every year of their formation. His eyes were a deep, settled gray that reminded Celia of the mountains in early morning before the light clarified them. He sat down, arranged his papers with deliberate calm, and surveyed the room with an expression that managed to be simultaneously patient and entirely alert. "We are here in the matter of Talbot versus Voss," he said. concerning the contested deed on 40 acres of mesa land registered in 1877 under the name of Daniel Talbot, deceased. He looked at the petitioner's table. "Mrs. Talbot, I understand you are representing yourself in this proceeding." Celia stood. She had worn her best dress, which was dark blue wool, practical and not ostentatious, and she had pinned her dark auburn hair up neatly. She looked directly at the judge. "That is correct, Your Honor." There was a rustle of murmuring from the gallery. Prescott, the opposing attorney, cleared his throat with barely concealed amusement. Voss continued his study of the ceiling. "Very well," said Judge Langston. He said it without surprise, without condescension, and without any indication that he found the situation unusual. He simply noted it and moved forward, which Celia would later think was the first thing that made her trust him. "Mr. Prescott, you may present the respondent's opening statement." Prescott's argument was thorough and well-constructed. He argued that Daniel Talbot's original deed, filed in 1877, had contained an error in the land survey coordinates that rendered it technically defective under territorial statute. He further argued that Harlan Voss had subsequently filed a corrected deed on the same land in 1881, after Daniel Talbot's death, and that this corrected deed superseded the defective original. He had documents. He had a surveyor's report. He spoke for 20 minutes in the smooth, unhurried cadence of a man who was accustomed to winning. Celia listened to every word. She did not write notes because she had already anticipated every argument Prescott was going to make. She had read the same statutes he was citing. She had read them more carefully. When Prescott sat down, Judge Langston looked at her. "Mrs. Talbot." She stood and walked to the center of the room because there was no lectern and she had decided she did not want one. She faced the judge directly. "Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Prescott has cited Territorial Land Statute 1873, Section 4, regarding defective deed coordinates. He has applied it accurately as written. However, that statute was amended in 1879 by the Territorial Assembly's Supplementary Act, which Mr. Prescott did not cite, and which I believe was either overlooked or intentionally omitted." She reached into the folder she carried and produced a copy of the amendment. The 1879 amendment specifically provides that a deed containing a surveyor's coordinate error does not become void if the land can be identified by two or more independent descriptors, such as the name of the filing party, the original survey date, and the recorded water rights. Daniel Talbot's 1877 deed contains all three of these descriptors. The land is identifiable beyond question. She paused, not for effect, but because she wanted to let the information land cleanly before continuing. "Furthermore," she said, "the corrected deed filed by Mr. Voss in March of 1881 was filed 4 months after my husband's death. Under territorial inheritance law, which I can cite if necessary, any land held by a married man at the time of his death passes directly to his surviving spouse, unless a valid will directs otherwise. My husband left no will, which means the land transferred to me at the moment of his death in November of 1880. Mr. Voss's filing came after that transfer was already in effect. He had no right to file on land that already belonged to another party, regardless of whether that party had yet formalized the transfer through the probate court. The law does not require immediate formal action to establish a right of inheritance." The room was very quiet. Prescott had straightened in his chair. Voss had stopped looking at the ceiling. Ralph Langston had not moved at all during her argument, but there was something different in his expression now. It was attention, not the polite attention he extended to everyone who appeared before him, but the sharper, more focused attention of a man hearing something that genuinely surprised him and who was honest enough to show it. Celia placed the copy of the 1879 amendment on the clerk's table, along with 3 other documents she had carefully organized. "I have also brought the original water rights registration, dated 1877, which lists Daniel Talbot by full name." I have the county assessor's records showing taxes paid on this land under the Talbot name every year from 1877 through 1881, including 3 payments I made personally after my husband died. And I have brought a sworn statement from Mr. Owen Briggs, our nearest neighbor, who has worked portions of this land under agreement with my husband since 1878 and can attest to continuous occupancy and use. She looked at Judge Langston steadily. The defect in the original deed was a transcription error by a territorial surveyor who miswrote 2 coordinate numbers. It was not an error by my husband. It cannot be used to void a document that accurately and demonstrably describes the land in question, especially not when that voiding would allow a third party to claim land through a filing made after legal inheritance had already occurred. She stepped back. I yield to the court, Your Honor. She sat down. The gallery was silent for a long moment, and then there was a collective exhale that sounded almost like a held breath being released. Prescott was already on his feet. Your Honor, the 1879 amendment has a specific provision regarding— Sit down, Mr. Prescott, said Judge Langston. His voice was calm and even, but it carried the weight of a man who did not need to raise it to be heard. I am aware of the 1879 amendment. I am also aware of its provisions. I will review the submitted documents. He spent 40 minutes reviewing them. The gallery waited. Celia sat with her hands folded on the table and breathed steadily. Josie was at home with Mrs. Alderman from next door, and Celia had told her daughter before leaving that morning that she was going to go talk to a very important man and explain something that mattered very much to their family. Josie had asked if it was like when Mama had talked to the schoolteacher about the reading assignment, and Celia had said yes, something like that, only a little more serious. Josie had given her a biscuit wrapped in cloth for luck. The biscuit was still in Celia's coat pocket. Judge Langston looked up from the documents. The court finds in favor of the petitioner, he said. The gallery erupted. Harlan Voss made a short, sharp sound. Prescott placed a hand on his client's arm. The 1879 amendment is applicable as cited. Judge Langston continued, speaking over the noise until the room quieted again. The Talbot deed of 1877 is hereby confirmed valid on the grounds of identifiable descriptors under the amendment. Furthermore, the court finds that Mr. Voss's 1881 filing was made on land that had already passed by operation of law to Mrs. Celia Talbot as surviving spouse of Daniel Talbot. That filing is declared null and void. Mrs. Talbot holds clear title to the 40 acres in question. Costs of the proceeding are assessed to the respondent. He struck the gavel. Celia sat very still for a moment. Her hands were still folded on the table. She felt the victory not as a burst of joy but as a slow, warm settling, like the feeling of coming inside from the cold. She had been cold for a long time. People pressed around her. Owen Briggs, who had driven in from his ranch for the hearing, gripped her hand and shook it. Several women from town offered congratulations with varying degrees of wonder in their voices. Even Mr. Hooper from the Mercantile had come, and he told her in a hushed, delighted voice that this was the most interesting thing to happen in Durango since the rail line arrived. Harlan Voss left without speaking to her. Prescott left with him. The matter of Voss was not entirely finished, because men like Harlan Voss rarely accepted a single defeat with grace. But Celia was not worried about that yet. She had won what needed to be won today. She was gathering her documents when she became aware of someone standing at her table. She looked up. Judge Ralph Langston was standing there, which was somewhat unusual, since judges typically did not linger in the courtroom after proceedings to speak with winning parties. He had removed his judicial robe and carried it over one arm, and in his plain dark coat and riding trousers, he looked less like an institution and more like a man. He was, she noticed now at closer range, quite a handsome man. The silver at his temples caught the afternoon light coming through the high windows. "Mrs. Talbot," he said. "Your Honor," she said. He was quiet for a brief moment, and there was something careful in the way he considered his next words, as though he was accustomed to choosing them precisely. I have presided over land cases in 3 territories, he said. I want you to know that I have never heard a better argued case than the one you presented today. Celia looked at him. She was trying to determine whether he was being kind or whether he was being honest, and she was good at reading people, had always been good at it, and what she found in his expression was neither condescension nor flattery. He meant it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I had excellent source material to work with." The 1879 amendment is quite clear. "The amendment is clear to those who know to look for it," he said. "Most attorneys practicing in this territory do not. You found it, understood it, and applied it to precisely the right point in your argument." He paused. "Where did you study?" "I did not study anywhere formally," she said. "I read." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to categorize exactly, but it contained a kind of recognition, and also something warmer than recognition. "Then, you read very well." She found herself smiling despite the formality of the moment, because there was something in the way he said it that was genuinely respectful rather than surprised, and respect was not something Celia had received in great quantity since her husband died. "I learned from Daniel that if something matters to you, you find out everything you need to know about it." He was like that. He studied irrigation methods for 2 years before he ever dug a channel. There was a brief, pleasant pause. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "Your husband sounds like he was a thoughtful man." "He was," she said. "He was a very good man." It was the truth, and she said it without performance. Daniel had been good. Not perfect, no one was, but honest and hardworking and kind to her and to Josie, and she had loved him in the steady, warm way that 7 years of shared life produces, and she missed him still, particularly in the evenings when the house grew quiet and the work of the day was done. But she had also discovered, in the 14 months since his death, that she was more capable of sustaining herself than she had known. That discovery was painful and clarifying in equal measure. "I hope," Judge Langston said, with a slight hesitation that she found humanizing, "that the matter is fully settled for you now. If Voss causes any further difficulty, you should not hesitate to bring it back before the court." "I will not hesitate," she said, and she meant it. "Thank you, Your Honor." She took her documents and her biscuit and walked out into the October afternoon. She told Josie that they had won. Josie ate her biscuit back and declared that the luck had worked perfectly. Celia laughed for the first time in weeks. The following Sunday she was at the Durango Mercantile, buying flour and lamp oil and a length of twine, when she encountered Ralph Langston in the opposite aisle selecting what appeared to be a very serious quantity of coffee. He was not in his judicial robes. He was in working clothes, a plain coat and tall boots slightly muddy at the heel, and he was reading the label on a coffee tin with the same focused attention he had given her documents in the courtroom. He looked, she thought, like a man who took everything seriously, including coffee. He noticed her at the same moment she noticed him, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, as if he was adjusting from one context to another. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, setting the coffee tin back on the shelf. "Judge Langston," she said. "Ralph," he said, and then appeared slightly surprised at himself for saying it. "In the street, that is." The formality belongs in the courtroom. She considered this. "Celia," she offered. He smiled. It was a quiet smile, not broad but genuine, and it changed his face considerably. She thought he probably did not smile enough and that this was a shame. They spoke for a few minutes about nothing consequential, the weather, which was turning cold as November approached, the new rail schedule that was supposed to reduce travel time to Denver, Mr. Hooper's recently acquired shipment of Eastern newspapers. It was ordinary conversation, the kind people make when they are really doing something else, which is learning the texture of another person. Celia noticed that he listened attentively, did not interrupt, and asked questions that showed he had actually heard what she said rather than simply waiting for his own turn to speak. She had forgotten how rare that quality was in a person. When she left the mercantile with her flour and lamp oil and twine, she walked home feeling the kind of quiet pleasure that a good conversation leaves, the sort that lingers longer than it should. She thought about that conversation rather more than she had any particular reason to over the following days, which she noted to herself with a mild and somewhat amused self-awareness. She was not a woman who was prone to flights of romantic fancy. She was practical and direct, and she had learned since Daniel's death to be even more so, because practicality was what kept the farm running and Josie fed, and the wood stacked before the first hard frost. She did not have the luxury of distraction, but Ralph Langston was not exactly a distraction. He was more like an interesting problem she found herself returning to, the way the mind returns to a puzzle that does not quite resolve. She saw him again at the end of October, at the small gathering that Pastor Henley hosted each year as a kind of community supper before the winter set in. It was held in the meeting hall, and most of Durango attended because free food in November was a compelling argument regardless of denominational preferences. Celia came with Josie, who immediately disappeared to locate the other children and left her mother standing near the long tables with a plate of corn bread. She spotted Ralph Langston across the room. He was talking to Owen Briggs, and Owen was telling some story that required expansive hand gestures, and Ralph was listening with that same quality of genuine attention, occasionally nodding. Owen said something that made him laugh, and Celia felt the smile happen on her own face before she was entirely aware of it. He caught her eye across the room. Neither of them did anything particularly dramatic about it. He lifted his coffee cup slightly in acknowledgement. She nodded. He excused himself from Owen and made his way across the room, moving around clusters of people with the unhurried ease of a man who had learned not to let crowds make him anxious. "Mrs. Talbot," he said when he reached her. "You said Celia," she reminded him. "So I did," he said. "Celia." He said her name the way certain people say a word they are testing, finding where it sits in the mouth. "Celia, you came alone." "I came with my daughter," she said. "She has gone to be feral with the other children somewhere." "I am told this is normal at her age." He looked genuinely amused. "How old is she?" 7, going on 37 according to herself. "She sounds formidable." "She is," Celia said with affectionate accuracy. "She has her father's stubbornness and my habit of arguing until the other party simply gives up out of exhaustion. Those are useful traits," he said. "They are when they are aimed at something worth aiming at," she agreed. "Less useful when she is trying to negotiate a later bedtime." He laughed again, more fully this time, and she felt something warm move through her at the sound of it. It was a good laugh, open and real. They stood together for a long time, talking easily about things that ranged across considerable territory. The state of the territorial courts, which Ralph explained were overwhelmed and understaffed. Celia's farm and what she planned to do with it now that the title matter was settled. Books they had each read. The particular quality of the mountain light in late autumn that turned everything amber and severe and beautiful all at once. He had been in Durango 6 months and had not yet had time to simply walk in the mountains, which he said with a kind of rueful resignation, and Celia said that was a genuine loss because the trail west of town along the Animas River was extraordinary in the fall colors. "You could walk it on a Sunday," she said. "The courts do not sit on Sunday." "No," he agreed. "They do not." There was a small, thoughtful silence. "I could show you the trail," she said. It came out more simply than she had intended, which meant it came out honestly. She saw him receive it, saw the consideration and the pleasure in his expression. "I would like that very much," he said. They walked the river trail the following Sunday. Josie came with them, because Celia was not the kind of woman who would arrange a solitary meeting with a man she was only beginning to know, and also because Josie was delightful company and more reliable than a chaperone, since she asked every question that adults were thinking but not saying. The trail ran alongside the Animas River, where the cottonwoods had gone entirely gold in the November chill, their leaves spinning down into the dark water like small bright boats. The mountains above were already white at the peaks. The air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and coming snow. Josie ran ahead on the path, stopping occasionally to throw stones in the river with the focused experimental interest of a person conducting important research. Ralph walked beside Celia, and they talked in the easy, continuous way they had at the community supper, one topic flowing naturally into the next. He told her about growing up in St. Louis, where his father had been a clerk for a trading company and his mother had taught school. He had studied law in Kansas City and had been drawn to the territorial courts because, he said with a frankness she appreciated, the law in the territories was still being made rather than simply being applied, and that seemed to him the more interesting work. She told him about Ohio, where she had been born and raised on her parents' farm, and about how she and Daniel had come west in 1874, when they were newly married and full of the particular conviction of young people that the best life was always slightly west of wherever they were. She told him about the first winter on the Mesa land, which had been brutal and had nearly broken them, and about the second spring, when the irrigation channels Daniel had so carefully designed finally worked, and the fields came up green and extraordinary, and Daniel had stood at the edge of the field and said very quietly, "There it is," and she had understood exactly what he meant. Ralph listened to all of this with the kind of attention that made a person feel their story was worth telling. "Do you miss Ohio?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "My mother is still there, I write to her, but the land here is mine in a way that Ohio never was. It was my parents' land and my grandparents' land. This land I helped build." "Yes," he said, and she could tell he understood the distinction. Josie appeared from the trees with a stick of impressive size and announced that she had found a walking stick better than either of theirs. Ralph examined it with complete seriousness and agreed it was exceptional, and Josie gave him a look of approval that children reserve for adults who treat them as equals. They walked back toward town as the afternoon light began to fail, and the mountains went purple against an orange sky. The cold deepened, and Celia could see her breath, and Josie had stopped running and tucked herself close to her mother's side the way she did when she was tired but would not admit it. Without making anything of it, Ralph Langston lifted Josie onto his back when she stumbled on a root in the dimming light, and Josie accepted this with the easy trust of a child who has not yet learned to be suspicious of kindness, and she rode the last quarter-mile back to the edge of town, asking Ralph questions about what it was like to wear a judge's robe and whether it was very hot. He answered every question seriously. Celia watched this with a feeling she could not immediately name. She named it later that night when Josie was asleep and the house was quiet and the November wind moved around the eaves. The feeling was possibility. It was the tentative, carefully held feeling of a door that had opened somewhere ahead, not guaranteeing anything, not demanding anything, but present and real and undeniable. November deepened into December. Celia had a farm to run, which in winter meant feeding the livestock and repairing fences and managing the firewood supply and preserving the last of the root vegetables and keeping the irrigation channels from freezing solid. She was not idle, and she did not expect to see Ralph frequently, nor was she certain she was ready for frequent. But they did see each other, in the way that people in a small town see one another when both of them have stopped pretending they are not looking. He came to buy supplies at the mercantile on Saturday mornings, and she came on Saturday mornings as well, and if they arrived at the same time, this was perhaps not entirely coincidental. He stopped by the reading room on Thursday evenings to exchange books, and so did she, and Mr. Hooper watched this development with visible satisfaction and told his wife, who told approximately everyone else in Durango. In December, Ralph came to the farm. He came because Owen Briggs had mentioned, in the casual way that Owen mentioned things while actually engineering them deliberately, that Celia's north fence line was sagging, and that she could use another pair of hands to set the posts before the deep freeze made the ground impossible. Ralph arrived on a Saturday morning with a post driver and his horse, a steady roan gelding named Webster, and he worked the fence line with her for most of the day, which meant they were side by side in the cold for hours, doing physical work together, which teaches you things about a person that conversation alone cannot. He worked without complaint and without showing off, which Celia appreciated. He was stronger than she had realized, and he understood fencing, though she was more efficient with the post driver, having done it regularly for years. When she told him this without softening it, he laughed and said she was right and asked her to show him the correct angle, and he improved immediately. Josie brought them coffee at midday and stood regarding them both with the evaluating eye of someone who had been told by Mrs. Alderman next door that the judge had come to help with fencing, and who had filed this information away in whatever complex internal system 7-year-olds use to process the movements of the important adults in their lives. They finished the fence as the light went flat and gray in the way it does before snow. Celia invited him to stay for supper, which she had cooked in the morning before they began working, a pot of rabbit stew and corn bread and apple butter from the summer's preserving. They ate at the small kitchen table, the three of them, with the fire going and the wind starting outside. Josie talked extensively about a sparrow she had been trying to befriend by leaving seeds on the windowsill, and about her reader at school, and about whether rabbits knew they were being eaten or whether they did not worry about things like that. Ralph engaged with every question on its merits. Celia watched him and Josie and felt the domesticity of the scene with a kind of wonder, because it was so ordinary and so warm and so unlike the solitary evenings that had characterized the last year. After Josie was in bed, Celia and Ralph sat by the fire with coffee, and the conversation settled into something quieter and more deliberate. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him across the fire. "I am aware that my position," he began, and then stopped, reorganizing his words with the carefulness she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. "What I want to say is that I have not sought the company of a woman since I came to Durango. I came here for the work, and the work has been sufficient. And then you walked into that courtroom, and I sat up there on that bench, and I listened to you argue a case that 3/4 of the attorneys in this territory could not have argued as well, and I thought—" He paused. "What did you think?" she asked very quietly. He looked at her steadily. "I thought, who is this woman?" The fire moved between them. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall, quiet and purposeful. "I am glad you told me that," she said. "Are you?" He was watching her carefully, not presuming anything, which was one of the things she admired most about him. "I have been trying to be sensible about you," she said. "I am generally a sensible person, but I have found that being sensible has certain limits when it comes to people worth knowing." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice was lower and more careful. "I do not want to complicate your life, Celia. You have built something real here, and you did it largely on your own. I would not want to come into it in any way that made it smaller rather than larger." She considered this. She had thought about it herself, in the late evenings when she was most honest with herself. She was independent in a way that had been forged by necessity and had become genuine, and she did not intend to surrender it. But independence had never struck her as incompatible with love. Her parents had been independent people who had loved each other deeply. Daniel had been his own man, and she had been her own woman, and they had built something together that was bigger than either of them individually. "I think," she said, "that people worth knowing make your life larger. The ones who make it smaller are generally not worth knowing." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. The snow outside was audible now, a soft, muffled settling. "Celia," he said. "Ralph," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a kiss. It was something simpler and more durable than either, a mutual acknowledgement, clear and unhurried, that something real had begun between them, and that both of them intended to treat it accordingly. He rode home through the new snow, and she stood in the doorway for a moment watching the dark shape of him and Webster disappear down the road, and then she went inside and banked the fire and went to bed feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hopeful. December brought Christmas, and Durango dressed itself for the occasion in the particular way of small western towns, with pine boughs on the storefronts and a tree in the meeting hall, and the smell of wood smoke and spiced cider everywhere. The community held a Christmas Eve gathering, and Celia went with Josie, who wore her best dress and her mother's old hair ribbon, and had opinions about the decorating. Ralph found her early in the evening, which was perhaps easier than finding someone in a larger city, but still required intention. He brought her a small paper package, which she opened to find a copy of a book on water engineering that she had mentioned on their walk in November, saying she had been trying to locate a copy. He had written her name on the flyleaf in careful, deliberate letters. She had brought him something as well, a length of warm wool in deep green that she had found at the Durango dry goods store and had thought suited him, and she had made it into a muffler with her own hands, because she could sew, and he was clearly operating with inadequate cold weather gear for a Colorado winter. He put it on immediately, there in the meeting hall, which made her laugh, and he wore it for the rest of the evening with entire seriousness. They danced. The fiddle player who came to every community event in Durango, a wiry man named Callum Dees, played reels and waltz-time pieces in alternation, and the floor filled with couples, and Josie danced with Owen Briggs's youngest son in the enthusiastic, technique-free way of 7-year-olds, and Ralph held out his hand to Celia and she took it. He danced the way he did everything else, with quiet competence and honest engagement, paying attention to her rather than performing. His hand was warm at her waist. He was tall enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and the candlelight in the hall was amber and steady, and the fiddle was fast and bright, and they were laughing at something by the third measure, and Celia thought she could not remember the last time she had been this simply happy. January arrived in Durango with the full force of a Colorado mountain winter, and life contracted around warmth and necessity. But the world does not fully stop, even in hard winters, and Celia and Ralph continued to find each other in the small daily rhythms of a town, where everyone occupied the same streets and the same stores and the same meeting hall. He came to the farm again in January to help when the roof of the small barn developed a leak that threatened the hay stores. He came in February when a section of the water channel froze and cracked and needed immediate repair, or the spring planting would suffer. Each time, they worked together and ate together and talked in the way they had been talking since November, with increasing ease and depth, and a growing comfort with silence as well, which is the more intimate accomplishment. Josie had, by February, quietly and without announcement, begun calling him Ralph instead of Judge Langston. Ralph received this promotion without comment, as though it were entirely natural, and responded to it with the same warmth he brought to everything connected with her. In March, when the snow began to loosen its grip, and the river ran high with melt, and the first tentative green appeared at the edges of the south-facing fields, Ralph Langston asked Celia Talbot if he could court her formally. He asked her in the reading room of Mr. Hooper's Mercantile, which was an appropriately unglamorous location, and which Celia later told him was perfect, because it was where she had first learned the law that won her land, and it seemed right that important things should happen there. "I am asking," he said, with the careful precision that was so characteristic of him, "because I want to be clear about my intentions, and I want to give you the opportunity to be clear about yours. I'm not asking for anything beyond the right to be open about my regard for you." She had known this was coming. She had been thinking about her answer for several weeks, which is to say that she had already given it to herself several times and was simply waiting for the occasion to give it to him. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He did not try to embrace her in the back corner of Mr. Hooper's Mercantile, which she also appreciated, though his expression was so openly glad that she felt the warmth of it from 3 feet away. Spring unfolded in the way that springs do in southern Colorado, which is to say, slowly, magnificently, and with the particular quality of earned light that comes after a genuine winter. The fields on Celia's mesa land began to show the green that Daniel had planted for and she had sustained, and the irrigation channels ran clear and well, and the fence line held, and Josie planted sunflower seeds along the south side of the house in a row that she measured and staked with great seriousness. Harlan Voss had not given up entirely. He was not a man constituted for graceful acceptance of defeat, and in February he had filed a new challenge with the Territorial Court, arguing that the 1879 amendment had been misapplied. Ralph Langston recused himself from the case due to his personal connection with the petitioning party, which was the correct and honest thing to do, and the case was assigned to a circuit judge who came up from Santa Fe. That judge reviewed the matter and dismissed Voss's challenge inside of 2 hours. The Talbot deed was confirmed again, and this time the dismissal included a notation about frivolous, repetitive filing that made Prescott wince publicly. Voss sold his holdings in the valley that summer and moved north toward Gunnison, and Celia heard the news from Owen Briggs with quiet satisfaction and did not lose another night's sleep over Harlan Voss. The spring and early summer were full and good. Celia's farm came into its full productivity, and she hired a hand for the season, a steady young man named Cal Estes who had come west from Missouri and was saving to start his own place. She managed the operation with the same efficiency and directness she brought to everything, and the farm flourished, and Josie was healthy and bright and full of opinions, and Ralph came on Saturday afternoons and stayed for supper and sometimes for the evening, sitting on the porch with her while the light went long and golden over the mesa, and the fireflies started in the creek-bottom willows. He kissed her for the first time on a May evening on that porch. It was not abrupt or surprising. It was the natural conclusion of a conversation that had been gradually, over months, moving toward exactly that point. He had reached across and taken her hand first, which he did sometimes now, and they had sat in the quiet of the evening, and she had turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the distance between them closed simply and honestly, and the kiss was warm and steady, like everything about him. She put her hand against his jaw, and he covered it with his own hand, and they sat for a long while after without needing to say anything, watching the last of the light leave the mountains. Josie, who had been getting a drink of water, came to the door and took one look at them and went quietly back inside. The following morning she told her mother that she thought Ralph was very nice and asked if he was going to live with them. Celia told her they were still deciding. Josie said that would be all right, but that he should know she had certain rules about the household. Celia asked what rules. Josie said, no loud boots after dark, and the good reading chair by the fire was hers by right of prior claim. Celia reported this to Ralph. He said the terms seemed more than reasonable. In June, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a great theatrical event of it, which was consistent with his character and was, Celia thought, exactly right. He came to the farm on a Saturday evening, and they walked out to the edge of the south field where the corn was already knee-high and the light was doing what it did in June, that long amber horizontal thing that makes the whole world look like a painting. He stopped at the fence line and looked out over the field, and then he looked at her. I want to marry you, he said. I have wanted it for some time. I am asking now because I think you are ready to hear it, and I think I am ready to say it clearly. He paused. I love you, Celia. I love the way you think and the way you work and the way you read the law at midnight because something matters to you. I love that you defended your own land in a courtroom and knew more about it than the professional attorney. I love that your daughter has rules about the reading chair. His voice was quiet and unhurried. I want to build something with you. I think we would build it well. Celia had not cried in the courtroom when she won. She did not cry now, but she felt the same kind of deep interior settling, only larger and warmer than before. I love you too, she said, and the simplicity of it felt true and exact. I have not loved someone the way I love you since Daniel, and it is different than that love was, because I am different and you are different and we are different together. But it is real and I am not afraid of it. She looked at him steadily. Yes, Ralph, I will marry you. He took her hand and held it, and they stood at the edge of the cornfield in the June light, and it was not complicated. It was as clear and as right as a good argument made before an honest court. They told Josie that evening, and Josie received the news with a satisfied expression that suggested she had already seen this outcome and had simply been waiting for the adults to catch up. She asked 3 practical questions. Would they still live on the farm? Would she keep her room? And what was Ralph going to bring to the house? They told her yes, and his books, which were apparently numerous. Josie said that was good because they needed more books. Ralph said he agreed entirely. They were married in September of 1883 in the Durango meeting hall because the church was being repainted. Pastor Henley officiated. Owen Briggs stood with Ralph. Celia's neighbor, Mrs. Alderman, stood with Celia, and afterward she told everyone that the bride had been the finest-looking woman she had ever seen, which was Mrs. Alderman's manner of expressing genuine affection. Josie wore the hair ribbon again and carried flowers from the garden she had planted. Ralph moved his things into the farmhouse, and his books, which were indeed numerous, filled 2 new shelves he built himself along the study wall. The reading chair by the fire remained Josie's by treaty. Life settled into a new shape, one that was larger and warmer than what had come before, which is what love is supposed to do when it is the right kind. The Territorial court kept Ralph occupied through most of the week, and Celia ran the farm, and together in the evenings they talked about the day, his cases and her fields and Josie's school, and the books they were both reading. He brought intelligence and steadiness to her life, and she brought him the grounded reality of the land and the seasons and the particular joy of watching things grow, which he had not known before, and which seemed to reach something in him that the law alone had not reached. He also brought to her life, somewhat unexpectedly, a community of people she had been at the edges of since arriving in Durango. As a widow without significant social standing, she had been respected but peripheral. As the wife of a federal circuit judge who had publicly called her the finest legal mind he had encountered in 3 territories. He had said this, it turned out, to the clerk and 2 witnesses, and it had become part of Durango's established mythology within days. She occupied a different position. She found the difference mildly amusing and took care not to let it change how she operated in the world, which was directly and on the merits of things. In the fall of 1883, a young woman named Evie Caro appeared at Celia's door asking for help. She was 19 years old, recently arrived from Kansas, and she had a dispute with her landlord over the terms of a rental agreement that had been altered in writing after she had signed it. She had no money for a lawyer and no family in the territory. She had heard about Celia Talbot, who had argued her own case before the Territorial court and won, and she had come to ask for advice. Celia sat with Evie Caro at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She reviewed the agreement, read the statute that applied, and explained clearly and precisely what Evie's rights were and what arguments she should make and to whom. She did not represent Evie, she was not an attorney, but she gave her the knowledge and the confidence to walk into the magistrate's office and speak for herself. Evie got her money back. Word of this spread in the way that word spread in Durango, and other women came, and Celia helped each of them with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to her own affairs. She was not practicing law in any official sense. She was sharing knowledge she had acquired through necessity with people who needed it. But she was good at it, and the women of Durango knew where to find her, and Celia found that it gave her work a dimension she had not anticipated. Not the satisfaction of her own farm's productivity, which was real and important, but the different satisfaction of seeing someone else walk out of her kitchen door with their head held up. Ralph watched this with quiet, deep approval. In the spring of 1884, Celia learned she was expecting. She told Ralph on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, with the coffee still brewing and the light just coming in the windows. He went still for a moment, and then his face did something extraordinary. Every careful, deliberate quality he possessed seemed to fall away for that instant, and she saw pure, unguarded joy in him, large and simple and young. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her, and she felt him breathe against her hair. "Are you well?" he asked. How do you feel?" "Entirely well," she said. "Very happy." He kissed her forehead and then her face and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips. Josie, who had excellent timing, came in for breakfast and looked at the two of them and asked what had happened. They told her. She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating, and then she asked whether it would be a boy or a girl. They said they did not know yet. Josie said she had certain thoughts on the matter and would advise them when she had decided. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring and summer. Celia continued to run the farm. She was not constituted for idleness and felt well, but she let Cal Estes take more of the heavy physical work, and Ralph came home for midday on the days he could manage it, which was more often than the court's schedule strictly permitted, suggesting that certain judicial prerogatives were being arranged with domestic priorities in mind. In November of 1884, she delivered their son. He arrived in the blue dark of a November morning, with the mountains visible from the bedroom window under a sky so full of stars it was almost unbearable. The midwife, Mrs. Price, who had delivered half of Durango's children, worked with calm efficiency and a running commentary that Celia found both irritating and comforting in the way that competent women often are. Ralph was present. He held Celia's hand, and when she told him at one point that she needed him to stop hovering and simply stand steady, he stood steady, and that was what she needed. The baby came, and he was healthy and loud, and when Mrs. Price placed him in Ralph's arms, Ralph stood with his son against his chest and looked at him with an expression that Celia, exhausted and entirely awake, would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. They named him Daniel James Langston. Daniel for the man who had first broken this land and built the water channels and planted the corn, and James for Ralph's father who had clerked and worked and raised his son with the conviction that honest work was its own reward. Josie met her brother the following morning when she came in from Mrs. Alderman's, where she had spent the night. She looked at him in his blanket for a long time with the evaluating expression she applied to everything new, and then she touched his hand very carefully with one finger and said he was smaller than she expected. She was 9 years old, and she became his most devoted protector from that first day, a role she took entirely seriously for the rest of her life. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was the particular kind of Colorado winter that reminds a person why the mountains are beautiful and why they are also serious. The snow came early and heavy, and the animas ran with ice, and the cold cracked wood and froze troughs and turned the world into a landscape of white severity that was also, in its way, magnificent. Celia's farm was prepared as it always was because she prepared it every autumn without fail. The barn was tight. The hay was sufficient. The root cellar was full. The house was full of warmth in a way it had not been before, and not only because Ralph had reinforced the south wall against drafts and built the wood stack higher than strictly necessary. It was full in the way that houses are full when there are people in them who love each other, the small noise of daily life, the fire in the kitchen, the sound of Josie reading aloud to Daniel, who was too young to understand but watched her face with complete attention, Ralph's voice in the evening discussing whatever case he had been working through, Celia's answers, the coffee always brewing. In the spring of 1885, something important happened in the Territory. A women's reading society in Denver had been advocating for some time that women in Colorado Territory should be permitted to study for and sit the bar examination. Colorado had passed women's suffrage on certain local matters in 1878, which placed it ahead of most territories, and the Reading Society argued that this principle should extend to the legal profession. They were making progress, which is to say they were making the kind of measured, slow, sometimes exasperating progress that actual change requires. One of the women involved in this effort came through Durango on her way to Albuquerque and asked to meet with Celia Talbot. whose case had apparently become known in Denver circles as an example of what an informed woman could accomplish without formal credentials, and what formal credentials might therefore make possible. Her name was Margaret Forsyth. She was 45 years old. She wore spectacles and a practical coat, and she carried a leather case containing more papers than Celia had ever seen outside of a courtroom. She arrived at the farm on a Wednesday afternoon, and Celia gave her coffee and they talked for 3 hours. Margaret Forsyth said that she believed women with Celia's ability and inclination should have access to formal legal education and formal practice. She said that the territory was changing and that change required people to push at its edges. She asked whether Celia had ever considered studying formally. Celia had considered it. She had considered it privately and carefully, and set it aside as impractical, for reasons of money and time and the particular logistics of being a woman with a farm and a daughter, and then a husband and an infant son. But she had never stopped considering it entirely, because the law had been the thing that saved her land, and it was the most powerful tool she had ever held in her hands, and she was honest enough with herself to know that she wanted to learn it more fully. She told Margaret Forsyth this. Margaret said that there was a correspondence course in law being offered through a university in Kansas, one that had been designed specifically to accommodate people who could not attend in person, and that it was open to women in territories where no explicit statute excluded them. Celia enrolled in the course in the fall of 1885. She studied at the kitchen table after Daniel was asleep, in the lamplight, with the same leather journal and the same methodical attention she had given to the 1879 amendment 3 years earlier. Ralph helped her where he could, discussing cases with her and working through arguments together in the evenings by the fire, which became the best hours of both their days. Josie, now 10, declared that she intended to be a lawyer as well. This was noted and recorded, and no one discounted it. Ralph sat on the bench and kept the territorial courts operating with his characteristic fairness, which made him respected by some people and actively resented by others, specifically the people who had been accustomed to the older, more flexible arrangement of justice in the territories where money and connections carried more weight than law. He had received 2 separate letters suggesting that his recalcitrance on certain matters might be noted unfavorably in Denver. He had responded to both letters with the same even, formal courtesy, and then continued doing exactly what he had been doing. Celia knew about this and said nothing specific, because Ralph did not need her to say the obvious, but she made sure the wood stack was always full and the coffee was always strong and the evenings were always warm, which was her way of saying what she meant. In 1886, Daniel Langston, aged 18 months, took his first independent steps across the kitchen floor, fell twice, and got up both times. Ralph, who had been watching from the doorway, was struck entirely dumb for a moment and then picked his son up and held him up level with his face, and Daniel grabbed his father's nose with both hands and Ralph made a sound somewhere between a laugh and something entirely else. Celia stood in the kitchen and watched this, and thought that nothing in her life had ever been more right. The summer of 1886 was good. The crops were productive. Celia was making progress in her studies. Ralph had taken on a junior clerk, a young man named Pierce who was eager and reasonably intelligent, and whom Ralph was quietly mentoring in the conviction that the territorial courts needed educated young men who understood both the law and the particular realities of the frontier. Owen Briggs and his wife came to Sunday suppers regularly. Cal Estes had bought his own small piece of land and was doing well. Harlan Voss sent no further legal challenges. He had, it turned out, encountered difficulties of his own in Gunnison and was occupied with those. He did not re-enter Celia's story, and she wished him whatever peace he was capable of finding, which was perhaps generous, but was also simply the nature of a woman who had moved forward and had no particular use for old grievances. In the autumn of 1886, Celia completed her correspondence course and passed the examination. She was not yet officially barred to practice in Colorado Territory. The question of whether women could formally sit the bar was still being argued in Denver. But she had the credential, the knowledge, and the paper that said she had mastered the material, and Margaret Forsythe wrote to tell her that her examination score was the highest the course had seen in its 3 years of operation, which Celia received with quiet satisfaction. Ralph read the examination results and then set them down on the table and looked at his wife for a long moment. "I told you in that courtroom," he said, "that I had never heard a better argument." "You did," she said. "I knew it then," he said. "Even before I knew you at all, I knew it." She looked at him across the table, and the lamplight was between them, and Daniel was asleep and Josie was asleep, and the house was warm around them. "You gave me a fair hearing," she said. "That was all I needed. A fair court and a fair judge. Everything else I did myself." "Yes," he said. "You did." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it with the same steady warmth he had always held everything that mattered to him. In 1887, Colorado Territory moved toward statehood. Colorado had actually achieved statehood in 1876, but the legal infrastructure of the Western Slope was still developing, and the question of bar admission for women continued to be argued at the state level. In the summer of 1887, following the efforts of Margaret Forsythe's Society and several other advocates, and one carefully written brief that was submitted to the State Bar Committee by a territorial judge who believed the argument was sound and cited, among other things, the demonstrated legal competence of women in documented proceedings, including the matter of Talbot versus Voss. The State Bar Committee voted to open the examination to women. Ralph never told her he had submitted that brief until after the committee's decision was announced. She found out from Margaret Forsythe, who wrote with the news and mentioned with characteristic directness that it had taken courage for a sitting judge to put his name on that argument. Celia came home from collecting the mail with Margaret's letter in her hand and found Ralph in the study annotating a case file, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up. "The brief," she said. He set down his pen. He did not dissemble. "Yes. You submitted it without telling me." "I submitted it because it was the correct argument, and I was in a position to make it credibly," he said. "I did not tell you because I did not want you to feel that your path forward depended on anything I did." "It does not. It never did." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ralph Langston," she said. "Celia Langston," he replied, with the small smile that she had loved from the first time she saw it. She crossed the study and sat in the chair beside his desk and took his hand and held it, and they stayed like that while the evening came in through the window and Daniel laughed at something in the other room and Josie's voice answered him. Celia sat the Colorado bar examination in the fall of 1887. She was one of 4 women in the state to do so in that first year. She passed. Her score was, again, among the highest recorded. She was admitted to the bar in December of 1887, in Denver, in a ceremony that was brief and formal and which she attended with Ralph, who sat in the gallery with his hands folded and his face composed and his eyes entirely, unconditionally proud. She became the first formally barred woman attorney in the southern Colorado region. She opened a practice in Durango in early 1888, in a small office above the assay office on Main Street, which had good light and a view of the mountains. Her practice was initially focused on land disputes, which she understood with particular thoroughness, and on the cases that other women brought to her, the Evie Caros of the territory who needed someone who knew the law and who would fight for them without requiring payment they could not make. She was 37 years old, and she was precisely where she was supposed to be. Ralph continued on the bench, and their professional lives occasionally intersected in ways that required careful navigation. She recused herself from cases that came before his court, and he recused himself from any matter in which she appeared, and they maintained the formal separation that the law required because they both believed in it. But the morning conversations over coffee and the evening discussions by the fire and the shared intellectual life of two people who loved both the law and each other continued and deepened. And it was very good. Josie turned 13 in 1888, and she was by this point a formidable person of considerable intelligence and strong opinions, who had read most of her stepfather's law library and all of her mother's course materials, and who had informed both of them that she intended to follow her mother's path and become an attorney. Neither Ralph nor Celia doubted her for a moment. Ralph began quietly directing Josie's reading, discussing cases with her in the evenings in the way that good teachers and good parents do, opening the door a fraction wider each time. Daniel was 3.5 and conducted himself with the earnest physical intensity of small boys everywhere, discovering the world through a process of constant experimentation that occasionally required minor medical attention. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and a personality that was his own entirely, warm and curious and somewhat loud. Ralph took him riding on Webster when the weather permitted, which was Daniel's supreme joy, and he sat in front of his father on the saddle with his hands on the pommel and his face entirely serious, as though riding were a responsibility he was managing with appropriate gravity. The fall of 1888 brought an election, and with it, the particular atmosphere of territorial politics that Celia had learned to navigate without getting too close to, since political proximity to a sitting judge required care. She cast her own vote in the local elections. Colorado women had been voting in local and school elections since 1878, with the straightforward satisfaction of a person exercising a right she did not take for granted. In November of 1888, Celia won her first major case as a formally admitted attorney. It was, fittingly, a land dispute brought by a widow named Mrs. Fern Holloway, whose 40 acres in the La Plata Mountains had been encumbered by a fraudulent lien filed by a neighboring mining company. The company had a real attorney and considerable resources. Celia had the law, and she had the particular quality of preparation that comes from someone who has done this work from necessity long before she did it professionally. She argued the case before Judge David Alcott, the circuit judge from Santa Fe who had handled the second Voss dismissal. Judge Alcott was a careful, experienced jurist who treated Celia with complete professional respect from the first proceeding to the last. She won for Mrs. Holloway, and the fraudulent lien was struck from the record, and the mining company was assessed costs and a fine. Celia came home that evening to find Ralph had already heard the verdict. Pierce the clerk had told him and had made dinner, which he was not accustomed to doing, and which was therefore something of an event. Josie had helped, and the result was competent if slightly overdone. Celia ate every bite and told them both it was wonderful. Daniel, at the table in his chair, announced that he wanted soup. This was unrelated to the verdict, but was attended to immediately. The years between 1889 and 1892 were full in the way that the best years are, not without difficulty, because difficulty is part of any real life, but full of the things that make difficulty bearable, which are love and work and the presence of people you trust completely. Celia's practice grew steadily. She took on a partner in 1890, a young man named Robert Hale who had come from Denver with his law degree, and who recognized that working with Celia Talbot was the most practically instructive legal experience available in southern Colorado. They complemented each other well. He had the formal training she had acquired through correspondence and self-study, and she had the deep practical knowledge and the particular understanding of frontier land law that had been built through lived experience. Ralph continued on the bench until the fall of 1891, when he was offered an appointment to the Colorado Supreme Court in Denver. He came home with the letter and set it on the kitchen table, and they both looked at it. This was a genuine decision, and they made it together as they made every significant decision, with full honesty about what each of them wanted and needed. Denver meant leaving the farm and Durango and the community they had built. Denver meant a larger court and a larger city, and a position of greater significance. Denver also meant leaving the place where Celia had planted herself so deeply. But Denver meant the Colorado bar and a larger practice, and Josie would be 16 and would benefit from the better schools. And Denver meant that the farm could pass to Cal Estes, who had been working portions of it for years, and who made Celia an honest offer that she accepted with the feeling that the land was going to good hands. They moved to Denver in the spring of 1892. The house they found was on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood that had bookstores and a good school, and a law library open to the public, which Celia considered non-negotiable. It was larger than the Durango farmhouse, and it took some time to feel like home, but homes take time in general, and this one eventually acquired all the qualities that made the Durango house what it was: books on every surface, the smell of coffee, the particular warmth of a fire well tended, and a family genuinely present in the rooms they occupied. Ralph joined the Colorado Supreme Court in September of 1892. He was 47 years old. He brought to that bench everything he had always brought: scrupulous fairness, unhurried attention, complete intolerance for corruption, and the quality of someone who had spent enough time in the territories to understand that the law must be big enough to accommodate the full reality of the people it serves. Celia established her Denver practice with the help of a referral from Margaret Forsyth, who had become a genuine friend over the years, and who attended the Langston household for dinner approximately every third Sunday when she was in the city. The Denver practice was larger and more varied than Durango had been, and Celia found herself in federal land court arguing cases that had implications across the state, which suited her formidable preparation and her entirely undecorated willingness to go directly at the center of a thing. She also, in Denver, began teaching a weekly seminar at a women's educational institute on the topic of legal rights and land ownership for frontier women, which grew in attendance every year, and which she delivered with the same direct, methodical clarity she brought to everything. Josie attended the Denver High School and was, by all accounts of her teachers, the most intellectually formidable student they had encountered in recent memory, which surprised no one in her family. She began at the University of Denver in 1894, studying first literature and then, inevitably, law. She sat the Colorado bar in 1899 and passed with the highest score in the examination that year, which she reported to her family over Sunday dinner with entirely characteristic composure. Ralph said he was the proudest man in Denver. Josie told him that was a reasonable position, and also that she intended to take a case he might find interesting if he happened to be on the relevant panel. And Ralph told her very solemnly that if she appeared before him, he would treat her with the same impartial attention he brought to all proceedings. And Josie said that was exactly what she was counting on. Celia watched this exchange and felt something so large and complete inside her that it was beyond naming, which is the specific feeling of a life being lived the way it was intended. Daniel grew into a broad-shouldered, quiet young man who had inherited his father's deliberate quality and his mother's directness in equal proportion. He liked the outdoors and horses and mathematics, and in 1901 he went to agricultural college in Fort Collins on a scholarship, which would have pleased Daniel Talbot, the father he had been named for, who had studied irrigation for 2 years before he ever dug a channel. The elder Daniel's 40 acres in Durango were thriving under Cal Estes management, and Cal sent a letter to Denver every spring reporting on the fields, which Celia read at the kitchen table and filed carefully with everything else that mattered. In the fall of 1901, Ralph Langston retired from the Colorado Supreme Court at the age of 56. He had served 9 years on that bench and had written opinions that were cited in courtrooms across the western states, several of which addressed questions of women's legal standing in property disputes that bore certain familiar structural resemblances to a case he had heard in Durango in October of 1882. He retired with full honors and the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who had done his work honestly and completely. He told Celia, the evening after his last day on the bench, that he was not sorry to be done, because the law would continue without him, and what he wanted now was time, which he intended to spend largely in her company. She told him she had no objection to that arrangement. They traveled that winter for the first time in their lives, by which she meant that they traveled for pleasure rather than necessity. They went east to Ohio, where Celia's mother, now elderly and alert and living with Celia's younger sister, held her daughter's face in her hands and said that she looked like a woman who had been very happy, and Celia said, "Yes, I have been very happy," and her mother said, "Good." They came back to Denver in the spring, and Celia continued her practice, which she had reduced but not closed, and Ralph began writing, which surprised neither of them, because he had been accumulating observations about territorial law and Western jurisprudence for 30 years, and it turned out that, when he finally sat down to write them, the prose was as clear and unadorned and exactly right as everything else he did. He published 2 books on territorial law and frontier justice. The second one was dedicated to Celia, which the dedication stated simply and without embellishment. For Celia, who knew the law better than anyone I have heard and who taught me the rest. She read the dedication alone in the study one afternoon, while Ralph was walking in Washington Park with their son, who had come home from Fort Collins for a visit. She sat with the book in her lap for a long time, and the light came through the study window the way it always comes through study windows in the late afternoon, slant and golden and honest. And she thought about the woman who had walked into the Durango courthouse 20 years before with a leather journal and a borrowed biscuit, and the 1879 amendment. And she thought about everything that woman had done and built and won and loved since. She thought about Daniel Talbot, who had stood at the edge of his field and said, "There it is," and meant the whole great improbable thing that life sometimes becomes when you work hard enough and love honestly enough and refuse, absolutely refuse, to let someone take what you have built. She thought about Ralph, who was walking in the park with their son right now and would come home for supper and would sit across from her, and they would talk the way they always talked, about everything and nothing and the things that mattered most. She held the book against her chest for a moment, feeling the solid weight of it. Then she set it on the shelf beside the other things that mattered, the leather journal with the margin notes, the water engineering book with her name written in Ralph's careful hand, and a pressed sprig of cottonwood leaf from the Animas River Trail, gone brown and fragile with years, which she had kept because some things deserved to be kept. She heard the front door. "Celia," Ralph's voice, easy and familiar and warm. "In the study," she called back. He appeared in the doorway, still in his coat from the park, with the particular color in his face that outdoor air gives even to a man of 56. He saw her standing by the bookshelf and looked at her with the expression she knew as well as she knew her own face in the mirror, the one that was entirely alert and entirely open and entirely his. "Daniel is staying for supper," he said. "He asked about the rabbit stew." "I made it this morning," she said. He smiled. It was still a quiet smile, not broad, and it still changed his face entirely. She crossed the room to him and he took both her hands in both of his, and they stood in the doorway of the study in the late afternoon light while their son's voice came from the kitchen investigating the contents of the pot, and the books stood on their shelves in the orderly companionship of gathered knowledge, and the mountains were out there somewhere beyond the city, still standing, still magnificent, still exactly what they had always been. "Happy," he said. "Yes," she said. "You." "Completely," he said. And he meant it with everything he had. She leaned up and kissed him, and he held her with the same steady warmth he had always held everything that mattered. And outside the windows Denver in the early years of a new century moved through its ordinary afternoon, and the world was wide and the law was clear, and the life they had built together was full and good and entirely their own.